What's all this gibberish on the front of my lens mean? And that's what today's video is all about. We're going to discuss the basics of lenses. For the purpose of today's video, we're going to talk about lenses made for common DSLRs or mirrorless cameras today. Typically, these cameras are based off of a 35mm frame. So we're going to assume that we're working with either a full-frame mirrorless camera or a full-frame DSLR. What we're going to do is we're going to talk through the numbers that are on this lens, either on the front of the lens or on the top, and almost all lenses have very similar markings. Let's start with the basics of a lens. Now, typically when you're purchasing a lens, the first thing you discuss is the focal length. And the focal length is merely just the field of view of the lens. In this case, the Canon 50mm typically sees about the same field of view as what the human eye sees. But the lower the number, the wider the field of vision. So a wide angle lens might be something as wide as 24mm, for example. And that means it's going to be seeing much wider than what our eyesight can see. Or you'll see a zoom lens that might be up to 200 meters, which means it's going to be a much narrower field of view, but everything is going to appear closer. And looking at the front of the lens, you actually see the words 50mm. So that's just describing the field of view for the lens. And again, the 50mm is about the same as what human eye sees.
Later on in the video, I'll show you some samples of what the different focal lengths look like.
The next number that's most important, and it's not super clearly marked on this lens, but you'll see the 1:1.8. The 1.8 on this lens indicates that the maximum aperture for this lens is 1.8. The smaller that number, the more light the lens can let in, and the more shallow the depth of field will be. That blurred out background comes from having a lens with a wide open aperture. So the smaller that number, the smaller the F number, the more light that's getting let into the lens, and the easier it is to blur out that background. Pretty commonly on professional grade lenses, you'll see fairly low F numbers. They can go as low as like 1.4. More commonly, you'll see a lot of lenses that come in at the 2.8 range, and then 4.0 is another range. And then you'll see some zoom lenses that have what they call a variable aperture. So what that means is that zoomed in at, say, 24mm focal length, the f-stop might be 3.5. And then when you would zoom out to, say, 70, that might change to a 5.6. That's not an exact example. I'm pretty sure that's you're not going to find a lens quite like that. But all that means is that lens, as you zoom out, the f-stop will close down a little bit more, which means it's going to let in a little bit less light. Professional photographers typically don't want to buy a lens that's got a variable aperture on that, because what we're looking for is maximum light all the time. Because the more light we have, the faster the shutter speed we can use, the easier it is to shoot in low light situations. But the trick is, when you do a lens that doesn't have a variable aperture, they usually go up in price rather significantly because the lens itself needs to be a lot larger, the opening. And the reason for that is this lens needs to be able to pull in a ton of light to be able to maintain that f2.8. So you'll typically see on a fixed focal length zoom, there are usually fairly large lenses so that they can let in a lot of light. You'll often see something like a 75 to 300mm lens, and it will usually have a much smaller opening than a lens that's like a 2.8 all the way through. So continuing around our lens, a few other things we'll notice is the symbol 77. What does that mean? Well, that means it's a 77mm diameter on the front of the lens. So that means if I want to put a filter on the front of this lens, I need to make sure, if I want to use the screw-in kind, that it needs to be 77mm. Again, different lenses will have different requirements there. Let's go back to our friend, the 50mm lens here. So as I turn this one around, you'll see on this one, it's a 52mm diameter. So 77mm, 52mm. And that's basically just simply the size of the filter that you would be able to thread on the front of this, or if you want to buy a lens cap, you would know I need to buy a 77mm lens cap for this one and a 52mm lens cap for this one. Okay, looking at our Canon zoom, there's some other numbers on the front of it. On this Canon zoom, you'll see a range down here of 70 to 200. That is your field of view for this particular lens. So when you have the 70 lined up on the dash, that means the lens is going to see the world at a 70-degree field of view. And if you slide all the way down to 200 at the telephoto range, this is going to mean that you're going to be zoomed in on your subject. The subject is going to look a lot larger, and that's a 200mm field of view. Looking at the little window on this screen, that is our focusing scale. So the top number is, the green is in feet, tells you when the lens is set right here, the focusing distance would be 7 feet on this lens. So basically 7 feet away from the lens, your subject would be in focus. This will help you when you're doing some manual focus work. You can fine tune it like that, and if you're really not sure, you could actually measure out and it should be perfectly in focus, whatever those markings are on that lens. On many professional lenses, you'll see a number of switches on the side of the lens. The top set of switches basically tells your lens where you want it to focus, what range, from as close as it can all the way, or do you want to zoom in a little bit so it doesn't spend time seeking the full length of the lens. The next one is AF, MF. That's basically turning off autofocus and manual focus. The next one is turning off image stabilization on this lens. On this particular Canon lens, the image stabilizer is built right into the lens, so you can turn that on or off. And then we just have particular modes, and these change slightly from lens to lens, so I'm not going to cover that right now. If you have questions about how that works, you can ask in the comments below and I'll talk about it. One other thing to bring up when you're looking at a lens, in particular this Canon lens, you'll see the words EF. It's just, that is the typical mount for Canon DSLR, so they used an EF mount for most of their professional grade bodies. As we've switched over to mirrorless lenses, Canon uses RF, Nikon, Sony, Olympus, they all use their own different types of mounts and nomenclature for that.
Okay, as promised earlier, here's a series of photographs starting with a 10mm lens and going all the way up to a 200mm lens. Hopefully you'll find this useful.
So thanks for watching this video. If you got some enjoyment out of it or found some useful tips, it would be awesome if you would like this video. I would love it if you would subscribe so you can get more videos like this.